Alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulullah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Amma ba'du fa'a'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome to another conversation. I'm Farhan Qureshi and I'm here with Brother Amini. Brother Amini, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Brother Farhan. It's nice to be within your company to have
It's
this
as
beautiful
it is
discussion.
always a blessing to be in your company. Everybody, Brother Amini, it has become a good friend of mine, a good acquaintance of mine. We have shared knowledge and perspective over the last year or so. And I definitely had to share Brother Amini with the world, given the depth of knowledge and perspective that he brings to the table. Brother Amini comes from a Muslim background, and he has studied the perennial philosophy quite extensively. And I want to get his knowledge about the perennial philosophy in the context of Islam as well, because of the audience. If we could touch on Sanatana Dharma or Hinduism as well, a little bit. And after we discuss the perennial philosophy, I kind of want to get into the debate that was had between Dr. Javad T. Hashmi and Dr. Shadee Elmasry on salvation and the fate of others outside of the fold of Islam. And we're going to get into that towards the latter part of the conversation. The conversation about the perennial philosophy is a completely different conversation than our analysis of that debate. I just want that to be clear. That these are two different conversations that we're having. One introducing the perennial philosophy, uh, and then the other being a debate that was had between two Muslim scholars, one from from Western academia, and the other from traditional, an ijaza type of, um, seminary type of scenario. So, before we get into the perennial philosophy, I want the audience who might be listening uh, to also understand a slight difference between the perspective that Brother Amini might hold and that I might hold. I do tend to be a free thinker and a spiritual seeker. Rather than sticking to a tradition, I say that I have a reverence for tradition. I find tradition to be sacred. I certainly indulge in tradition and practice. However, I'm quite a free thinker and a spiritual seeker, rather than a traditionalist. Whereas Brother Amini is a traditionalist. He practices Sunni Islam, and so that is a slight difference between us. And I think that there is a lot to be gained from this conversation. So, with that being said, Brother Amini, um, again, before we get into the perennial philosophy, there's a clip, Mohammed Hijab, who in the past has said that people like me who have beliefs the way that I do, for all intensive purposes, their beliefs align with other belief systems. Why are they holding on to the Muslim label or identity? They should just claim that they have apostatized. That's what Mohammed Hijab has said. And he said this about Mufti Abu Layth and Javad T. Hashmi in the context of their conversation where they were saying archetypes and fiction exist within the Quran, which I also subscribe to, right? In the Jungian sense, archetypes and mythology occur in religion to convey a moral or principle.
Like, with all due respect, there's lots of ex-Muslims out there that just explain to the world that, okay, I'm an ex-Muslim now. Others, like Majid Nawaz and others, they, for some reason, cling on to the Muslim label, whereas, for all intents and purposes, what they believe is nothing to do with the religion of Islam. In fact, it's more in line with other belief systems or ideologies.
Again, most Muslims, because I take that perspective, would consider me a kafir. To that, I say, lakum dinakum waliya din. Uh, However, again, so the reason why I throw this ex-Muslim label around partly is because of the principle of what Muhammad brought up. I say that, what, if I'm not a Muslim according to mainstream, to this mainstream Islam, if the Quran and Sunnah condemn people to hell for a belief in Aqidah, then that's not what I believe. That's not my religion. I have apostatized from that. I am an ex-Muslim.
Yeah, I mean, they're all about zuhud, and like they'll like literally just give up everything in life. Everything is just open, and a lot of it, especially without proper aqidah, leads to perennialism.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh,
Yeah.
without
So-
proper aqidah, it becomes all spirituality.
Yeah,
And no
absolutely.
aqidah.
And then you get like pantheists who believe that, you know, God is everything and everywhere. And then you get perennialists. They just, oh, everybody's peace and love. And we just take everybody, right? So,
However, if Islam is broader than that, if in the way that I look at it, there's truth with a capital T, and any worldview or perspective that aligns with truth, whether it's a Christian denomination, a Hindu denomination, a Muslim denomination, a Stoic perspective, if it lines up with truth with a capital T, to me that is haq. And so when I'm listening to Muslims and truth comes from them, I can recognize that as truth. Now, how to determine that?
Me personally, as a I guess a scholar, is, I think ultimately, proof can only come through direct experience. We can sit around and talk about reason and evidence and things like that, but you have debates with your spouses, and reason and evidence doesn't make a big difference. So people, human beings, ultimately, reason is based on certain conceptions of reason. Reason is based on certain definitions. If you change those definitions, if you change those conceptions, the argument doesn't work as well, or doesn't work at all anymore.
Brother Amini, do you have any comments about the Muhammad hijab statement? And then we can get into the perennial philosophy and how we can, pursue truth, have an understanding of truth, and what are some of the core principles that we're looking at.
All right, thank you, Brother Farhan. And to be honest, this is an honor to be able to have the liberty to have these discussions, and we're in a certain global stage whereby there's an openness to having these discussions, right? Whilst back then it would have been something that an elite would be having. So that's great. And going back to the clip that you're talking about, I would say I used to have those beliefs. that's the thing. I used to be an exclusivist, in a sense that I believed that it was our way or the highway. You either believe in this supposed orthodox version of Islam, or you're not a Muslim, right? And while I would say right now I'll be considered to be with you an apostate, or I would say a heretic. But let's just quickly look at what Islam is when the Quran is speaking about Islam. There's two particular verses that the Quran seems to be quite clear as to the exclusive nature of Islam, right? Inna dina inda Allahi Islam, surely the religion upon God is Islam. And the other one, which is 385, the one that I just mentioned is 319, and the other one is 385, if people want to reference them. وَمَنْ يَبْتَغِ غَيْرَ الْإِسْلَامَ دِينًا فَلَنْ يُقْبَلُ مِنْهُ. Whoever takes other than Islam as a religion, it won't be accepted upon him. Now, of course, people have tried to define what Islam is and what Deen al-Islam is, right? And with all these orthodox tenets, right? That okay, you have to believe in these, believe in God, believe in the prophets, including the Prophet Muhammad, believe in the teachings and follow the teachings of Muhammad. Now, if you do not follow those, and if you do not believe in those, I'm putting believe here in quotation marks, then you're not a Muslim. But we really have to discuss, what does it mean to believe in Islam, right? And what is Islam? Well, the Quran itself seems to be pointing that Islam is submission. The previous prophets, who had quite drastically different teachings than the teachings of the Quran. If you look at the Torah, it has, yes, there are some similarities, but you could find quite a great number of differences. The Christian tradition with the Gospels has a quite different kind of framework or theological framework than Islam. But it seems to be encompassing all of them. And it seems to be saying, look, all of these previous prophets who had different teachings externally, we'll come to discuss what it means internally in perennialism, were Muslims. So would we take them out of the fold of Islam because they had different theological tenets? Another thing, the clip was more against also the clip was trying to go against the idea that one who believes the stories in the Quran and the previous books as myths isn't a Muslim, basically, because they're basically saying it's fiction. You're muted, Brother Farhan.
I agree with you, brother Amini, that that conversation was in the context of, discussing whether certain stories are fiction or archetypal rather than literal, right? And but however, Mohammed Hijab also says, somebody like Majid Nawaz, right, who isn't a perennialist, who isn't doesn't have view the Quran as mythological. I've never heard him say it, but somebody like Majid Nawaz, from what I hear, he's grown his beard and he's going back Salafi, or some. I'm not 100% sure. That's what I've heard. I did see a picture of him with a bigger beard, but the idea is that Mohammed Hijab says that even somebody like him, why even claim to be Muslim? Your beliefs are outside of the fold of Islam, and so there's no point in terms of continuing to claim to be Muslim, but it's not limited to somebody who says that Islam, the Quran has mythology in it, right, or archetypes in it. It's anybody who falls outside of the mainstream narrative, right? You're not Muslim, so your beliefs align with other belief systems, so go, yalla, right? And that's kind of what I did, hence claiming to be an ex-Muslim, but again, having a reverence for the traditions, having a reverence for even Islam, having nothing but love for the Muslim community. A part of what I do, I would stand up against Islamophobia, right? To anybody who think and anti-Muslim bigotry, two different things. I don't think Islam is one thing. I think that there's a diversity of perspective there, and I would go as far as saying I love Islam. Right, I absolutely love the tradition, the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Quran. There's a lot of reverence, deep reverence that I have for these traditions. But according to these mainstream Muslims, I'm a kafir, I'm zendiq, all of the rest of the stuff. So yeah, fine. I think that there's a place for people who might be leaving Islam and reject some of the teachings of the mainstream Muslims. There's a place for people to consider something like perennialism, universalism, and pluralism, which we're going to get into in a moment. As we get into perennialism, Brother Amini, here's what I want to say, and I want to see if you agree with me, right? This is what it comes down to, and this is how a conversation about perennialism is different than a conversation about universalism or pluralism, right? So the conversation that Jawad Hashmi has with Dr. Shadee Elmasry is a conversation about universalism. It's not a conversation about perennialism, right? And so what is the difference between the two? So universalism speaks to the salvation and the reconciliation of souls in the afterlife with God, right? So I'll say that again. Universalism is the perspective that all will be saved or all will be reconciled unto God, right? Whereas perennialism says that there is a common core or a common spirit to especially the mystical traditions across the world, right? And that common core and that common spirit pertains to two things. With regards to Islam, it pertains to a path of tazkiyatun nafs, that is self-purification, and that process of self-purification leads to a knowledge of God, a ma'rifah of Allah that is esoteric or subjective in nature. And what the mystics across the world, across culture, across history, after a process of tazkiyatun nafs, or in the context of Buddhism, it would be the eightfold path of Buddhism, the yamas and niyamas of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And so this what these things do is that they create a lifestyle for the individual, right? In Hindu terms, it creates a sattvic lifestyle, right? And through this process of self-purification, self-awareness, self-knowledge, self-mastery, the knowledge of God comes about. And what is the knowledge of God from when we study the mystical traditions? It is specifically what the Sufis have called wahdatul wujud. It is an experience of non-duality or oneness, right? And this is so essentially this is where the perennial philosophy is getting at. A process, a lifestyle where that is a process of self-purification leads to a knowledge of God, and the highest knowledge of God is one of non-duality, right? That all is one. And so that is a different perspective, Brother Amini, than merely a perspective of universalism that all will be saved, right? It is a different perspective. And in my view, and we're going to show a clip of Yasser Qadi and then get into perennialism, right? And notice that we're going to bring back up how Javad Hashmi and Dr. Shadee Elmasry, and rightfully so, avoided the perennial philosophy, and they also avoided an allegorical interpretation and getting into allegory of the Quran and so on and so forth, the archetypes, the mythology. They avoided that conversation, and Javad Hashmi rightfully so did that. But the point is that the argument that Yasser Qadi is about to make, not an argument, but the proposition of Sufis who perceive and believe in Wahdatul Wujud and how they come to universalism is different than a textual or scriptural approach, the way Hashmi and traditionalists do it, right? Because the mystics are all about ma'rifah and the experience of the divine. And they come to, let's be honest, the mystics are not debating scriptures and Aqidah, right? They're talking about an experience that leads to an insight about what people have been, in terms of scriptures and religion, what people have been trying to ascertain. It is coming from an experiential point of view. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play this clip from Yasser Qadi, and then we'll talk about the perennial philosophy.
The first group is best exemplified by people like Ayn al-Qudat al-Hamadani, Ibn Farid, Ibn al-Arabi, Ibn Sab'in, Jalaluddin al-Rumi, and others of their nature. Their writings do have elements that can be considered to be supportive of pluralistic doctrines. For these Sufis, anyone who had a genuine love of the divine was on the correct path regardless of a specific religion. The belief in the validity of other religions by these Sufis was not due to any inherent doctrine that truth itself was more than one, but rather was based on the doctrine that there was no existence of anything other than the truth. In other words, a belief in the validity of all religions was a natural result of the belief in monism or wahdat al-wujud. For if there was no existence other than the existence of God, this implies that anything anyone worshipped would in fact be God. And there are a number of explicit quotes from Ibn Farid, Ibn Arabi, al-Rumi and others that clearly link belief in wahdat al-wujud to a case of salvific pluralism.
So Brother Amini, given this statement from Yasser Qadi, right? This is again a different approach to universalism, that all are saved, than the Quranic argumentation that was given in the Hashmi debate. What is your perspective on how is this the perennial philosophy essentially? What is the perennial philosophy from your perspective? Can you define it in an Islamic context? How does it, for example, relate to Hinduism? If you could spend the next several minutes explaining that and helping us better understand it.
All right. Thank you very much, Brother Farhan. The perennial philosophy, or as the perennialists will love to call it, Sophia perennis, right? Instead of Philosophia perennis. And I'll explain the difference. Is the insight that within all expressions of wisdom, there is a metaphysical unity, is a metaphysical core, right? So there are many paths or expressions of wisdom, but one metaphysical core, one truth, the truth with a capital T, right? And these paths of wisdom, each in their own way, according to the communities that they were revealed in or were founded in, according to the geography, according to the history, manifest that truth or express that truth. So there's kind of two very important things in perennialism. Number one, the unity of traditions, or the transcendent unity of traditions, that these paths, and tradition here meaning the link between the external expressions and the internal reality or the internal truth, right? That's number one. Number two is symbolism, very important. Why? Because the truth in itself is ineffable. You cannot, it's beyond any particular expression. So it has to be symbolized, and that symbolism then has to be interpreted, has to be penetrated for us to be able to realize the truth. So what you, for example, expressed concerning Islam, you have expressed like three different things, which of course are connected. You have the Sharia, which is what everyone is taught about Islam, right? Which is the external sheath, the external body of the tradition. And then you have the tariqah. Tariqah is the path, it's the method, it's the way, which are so many tariqahs, so many ways in Islam. Forget about other traditions. So many tariqahs in Islam, which are ways, they are links, right? And that is the way which helps you do tazkiyatun nafs, right? You're purifying your soul. It's the purification of the psyche, right? And then you have what you called ma'arifa billah, the knowledge in God. That is the core. That is the transcendent unity. So that transcendent unity, once realized, is oneness, as you expressed, wahdat al-wujud, the oneness of being. Now, the problem with, in a sense, translating as oneness of being, or monism, as some people would like to put it, is it makes it seem as if you're denying all these things that are surrounding that truth, right? That you're saying, oh, there's only just one thing, just one reality, which, yes, it is one reality, but not one thing. There's so many expressions. But at the same time, you realize that beyond all these so many expressions, this is just one underlying reality. Everything is simply an expression of reality. Now, give that reality any name. Allah, Brahman, Tao, Yahweh, doesn't matter. What matters here is that there's one underlying reality, one unity, which is beyond all these particular expressions, but which is expressed in these or symbolized in these particular expressions. So the best way I would like to put it is the way the Advaitins, the non-dualistic tradition of Hinduism, puts it. Advaita, non-dualism. So wahdat al-wujud, if I was to translate it into English, is it oneness of being, which is of course the kind of the literal translation, but the actual kind of, in a sense, experiential translation is non-dualism, I would say, right? So in the sense that you're affirming that there is a truth, there is a reality that is non-dual, that has no second. And of course, if we were to translate it in the Islamic language, we will say, Qul huwa Allahu ahad. That ahad there is non-dual, there is no second. It's unique, it is profound, it is transcendent. That's how I would kind of put it in a nutshell. Yeah.
And the emphasis here is that this is an experience, right? So when the Sufis talk about fana fillah, right, that this is something that is experiential. When the Sufis talk about ma'rifah, that this is something that is experiential, right? When Muslims talk about ihsan, they talk about something that is experiential. And so whatever theology or philosophy it's subsequent to that knowledge which is then experienced, correct?
Yes. So Ibn Arabi, you mentioned ihsan, then kind of triggered my memory on that part. This is a hadith, that the tradition of the Prophet, whereby a mysterious figure came to the Prophet and his students, and he was asking this question. And one of the questions, what is ihsan, right? And we could translate as goodness, for example. That's the kind of the literal translation. And then the Prophet says, أن تعبد الله, it is to worship God كأنك تراه, as if you see him. فإن لم تكن تراه, and if you do not see him, فإنه يراك, God sees you. But Ibn Arabi says, look, you could read this another way. Ibn Arabi says, أن تعبد الله كأنك تراه. He's using the same words, but a different translation. It is to worship God as if you see him. فإن لم تكن, and if you are not, right? تراه, you will see him. فإنه يراك, for he sees you. So Ibn Arabi is saying, look, the point here isn't only to imagine as if you're seeing God. That is the process of tazkiyatun nafs. That is the tariqah part. You have to imagine, you have to engage your imagination. But beyond that, what you have to do, as you've mentioned, fanafillah, is to annihilate. Because why are you cleansing your ego? Is to take it away of the picture, right? It is to cleanse the that which is blocking and veiling the truth, right? And then reflect the true, kind of the true light of God. فَإِن لَمْ تَكُنْ, if you are not, you will see him. Then, of course, that is an affirmation that God also sees you. So you're seeing God is God seeing you. That's the correlation that Ibn Arabi makes. Yeah.
Right. And so Brother Amini, you brought up the transcendent unity of religions in Prishov Shuyon's words. I'm going to throw some names out there really quick. So, Brother Amini, there have been some Western thinkers who have studied, who like Brother Rene Gunon, Prishov Shuyon, Martin Lings, who explored the mystical traditions and came up with this notion that, the perennial truth, the perennial wisdom occurs across culture and across religion. So somebody like Sayyid Hussein Nasser is just like you, is a Muslim who follows the school of thought within the tradition of Islam, and is still ascertaining this transcendent truth, right? It came up in Hashmi's debate that there is a primordial religion, right? Primordial religion. Jesus was a Muslim. Abraham was a Muslim. All of creation is submitting to God's will. So there is this. It transcends tradition, right? The tradition of Jesus, the tradition of Moses, the tradition of Shankara, the tradition of Buddha. Truth transcends exoteric forms, language, words, doctrines, rituals, prayers, what you see people doing externally with their mouth and their tongue and their body, and what they're professing through their mind is an exoteric form. And truth in the primordial religion transcends those forms, essentially, right? So I would go as far as saying that when a Christian prays to the Trinity, that they're not praying to a Trinity. They're not praying to a concept, right? That prayer, that yearning for the divine, that connection with the divine is an esoteric one. It comes from a place without words, without language, without doctrines, without any exoteric form, right? It is simply the individual connecting with source, right? And so prayer and worship, from my perspective, is of nothing other than Allah by virtue of one's inner intention, right? It's not whether I call him Jesus or Krishna or Allah, or whether I have a concept of Tawheed, that a doctrine of Tawheed or something like that, but rather that connection is sacred regardless of what words you use. Now, this is diametrically opposed to what Dr. Shadee Elmasry says in the clip that we played. That he says that this is perennialism. You have to have Aqidah, right? So, I mean, I call the Sunni Muslims Aqidah worshippers, right? They worship their Aqidah. That's what they do. They worship their doctrines instead of Allah, right? That's my perspective. What do you think about Aqidah? Now, I think that Aqidah and theology and philosophy can play a role in one's spiritual development and comprehension and so on and so forth. But to say that you need Aqidah to be saved, that because you have a belief that God is a Trinity, that there's something wrong with this and that you will be condemned to hellfire for a belief that you have. Now, if I may qualify, now I come from my background in psychology and counseling. I'm interested in why people think what they think, believe what they believe, how somebody from a psychological point of view has an emotional attachment to their identity as a Muslim, as a Christian, to their belief systems, and so on and so forth, right? And I usually, when I argue, I'm not going to argue from scripture, right? I'm going to argue from social sciences, talking about the human condition and how what that looks like in the context of divine justice. I'm interested in Christian scholars debating the Bible, whether it teaches universalism. I'm interested in Muslim scholars debating whether the Quran and Sunnah teach universalism and perennialism and so on and so forth. But as far as I'm concerned, I'm wondering what worldviews align with truth and how do we decide truth? What I said is that we're looking for this common core of tazkiyatun nafs, right? Is there a purification process happening? Right? Is there a self-awareness process happening? And that is it, right? The good deeds that come, they come out of our inner transformation, out of tazkiyatun nafs, out of the practices that we're doing, right? Qalb salim, which is a state of the heart, comes out of the practice, and it doesn't require nakida, right? If you apply Christianity, the seven deadly sins, Dante's Inferno, avoiding, gluttony and greed and things like that. If you follow the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, as we mentioned earlier, the yamas and niyamas of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, if you live that lifestyle, if you follow the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, which I don't think any Muslim can have an objection against. When you look at it, a Muslim will look at that and say that there's nothing wrong with it. I don't think that even a Salafi Muslim will look at the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali and say that in principle, this is what a human being should be striving for, right? This is the common core, a part of the common core, including the metaphysical aspect of it that you mentioned, that it leads to an experience of the divine that is non-dual, right? And the perennialists say that across the tradition, Sufi, Taoist, across all of the Christian traditions, the Gnostics, Meister Eckhart, subjective idealism, the emanation gradation model of the Neoplatonists, and so on and so forth. There's so many perspectives that line up with what we would say is the perennial philosophy. Speaking of a non-dual reality, right? Monism, that the mystical traditions have done so. Why? Because we can prove through cross-cultural studies and meta-analysis that this is an experience that is reported throughout history and across culture, right? This is the evidence that we have for a perennialist worldview. So essentially, that's kind of my, that's how I kind of look at it. But then you have these Sunni Muslims who are Aqidah worshippers, and they are absolutely adamant that Aqidah is the way to salvation. And Christians do that too. What is your perspective on all of that, Brother Amini?
It's important to begin with an important realization that the goal of exoteric religion or exoteric tradition is different from the esoteric tradition. The exoteric tradition, and this kind of points to the debate between Dr. Hashmi and Dr. Elmasry, right, is based on salvation. And it is based on dual thinking. There is God, there is us. God is all good. We're, a result of the fall, and we have so many problems. We need to work it out so that this God can save us. That's the exoteric goal. The goal of the non-dualists is to say, I have to realize the non-dual. So it's realization or recognition. It's something we know innately, but we're just veiled from seeing it because we're so busy doing other stuff. Hence, tazkiyatun nafs. You're purifying your soul. So the goal of the non-dualists, be they Islamic in the Sufi tradition, right, or the Irfani tradition, or the Hesychast tradition in Christianity, or the esoteric paths of Christianity, or Kabbalah in Judaism, or the Vedantic tradition in Hinduism, or the Buddhic tradition, or the Taoists, is what we might identify as liberation, right? Or enlightenment, moksha, nirvana, right? That is the point. That's our aim. So for the non-dualist, it's not that there is an other being called God, but there is a stationless station, that is a stateless state that is the divine. And our aim is to elevate ourselves, is to ascend to that reality and realize ourselves, in a sense, quite controversially, as that divine. Right? And for example, when the Quran says, وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِنَا, we breathed unto him of our spirit, unto Adam. And Adam here isn't just a mere one human being. It is the totality, it is the archetype, the prototype of all human beings. We breathed unto them of our spirit. So the aim is to realize the ruh, not the nafs, but the ruh, the pure consciousness, the pure spirit within us, right? So it's very hard, of course, to argue with someone who sees dualistically in a non-dual way. We can try, and that's what we're doing right now. And so the point is to show that there are pointers in all of these traditions, all of these paths, in all these aqidas, if you want to put them in that sense. But I would rather say in all these traditions, in all these teachings, right? Rather than one word as aqidah, seems to be quite limited in its framework. So you look at the Quran, for example, it says, فَأَيْنَمَا تُوَلُّوا فَثَمَّ وَجْهُ اللَّهِ. Whithersoever you turn, there is the face of God. كُلُّ شَيْءٍ هَالِكْ إِلَّا وَجْهَهُ. Everything is in a state of perish except his face. كُلُّ مَنْ عَلَيْهَا فَانٍ. Everything upon it will perish, is in a state of perish now as we speak. وَيَبْقَى, and there persists and there subsists only the face of God. So we have to, again, distinguish between these two paths. The path of salvation, which is very dualistic, and it seems for that path, of course, you have to follow certain fixed tenets. But then the problem is when they say, oh, that's the only path, that the only way is to be saved. But there are coming other people who say, look, we agree with you in a certain measure. So, for example, the Hindus will say, what you're doing is what we identify as bhakti yoga. That is the path of unity through devotion. And of course, if you are devoted to a being you call God, then you have to follow the rules of that God. But there's another path. For example, Jnana Yoga, which is the path of gnosis, what we're talking about right now. Ma'arifa. That path is not this. That path is the path of liberation and enlightenment. Now, of course, if we go deeper, these two paths are one. Because ultimately, a perennial is to say, look, it's just non-dual reality, right? Of course. And that's why for a gyan, for a person who is following the path of gnosis, it's okay to say, look, I understand where you're coming from. But also you're limiting yourself too much. You're saying, oh, this is the only path. Whilst if I go, for example, back to the Quran itself, realizes so many paths. It says, لِكُلٍّ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ شِرَعَةً وَمِنْهَاجًا. To each one of you, we have granted a law and a method. Now, some people say that means to each community, to each tradition, but some even say to every particular human being. Every particular human being. There are as many tariqas as there are human beings on earth. وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ, if God had wanted, لَجَعَلَكُمْ أُمَّةً وَاحِدًا, He would have made you one community. وَلَكِنْ لِيَبْلُوَكُمْ فِي مَا أَتَاكُمْ. But it is to test you upon what you have been given. My disposition is not your disposition, brother. What you're going through, I will never be able to go through. Because you're a unique individual human being who has his own path towards God. What does the Quran say? فَاسْتَبِقُوا الْخَيْرَاتِ. Race towards that which is good, right? That is the most important thing. And how do you do that? Of course, it is ultimately, yes, you could follow the path and say, okay, I'm going to follow the sutras or the Quran and its Sharia or the Christian path. But there's also another side of the innate disposition that we have. So, for example, just to finish up so that I can give the mic back to you, there's a verse in the Quran that says, فَأَقِمْ وَجْهَكَ لِلدِّينِ حَنِيفًا. Point your face towards the upright tradition, the Deen Hanifa, right? فطرة الله التي فطر الناس عليها, the disposition of God by which God disposed all people. So again, it uses فطرة الله التي فطر الناس. It's the same word. So we were created by the very nature of God, right? And then it says لا تبديل لخلق الله, there is no change in the creation of God. ذلك الدين القيم ولكن أكثر الناس لا يعلمون. And that is the upright tradition. So there's an innate nature within us that tells us. It's clear. If you are to focus on that, it's clear to tell you, oh, this is the way to go, right? And all these traditions are saying, look at that. They're not saying we are the path. They're saying, look at that. Look at your fitrah. Look at your innate divine disposition. And there, once you realize that, as you said, you will reflect the entirety of truth, the absolute truth. Because why? You are the truth in Farhan. I am the truth in Amini. And everyone is the truth in their own way.
Ana al-haq, as Mansur al-Halaj said, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So no, I agree with you that this is, even when the Muslims say Deen al-Fitra, right? That it is talking about an innate knowledge that we have, right, of Allah. And from our perspective, that fitra includes that knowledge of oneness, of non-duality, which is essentially, that is the truth of Allah, is that there's only existence, essentially, right? And so, and that is something that is known by the fitra. Now, Muslims can disagree with you that oneness, or the knowledge that you are existence, or all is existence, or that all is an illusion and there is only an existence. That this is not the perspective, right? That mainstream Muslims take, but rather the fitra simply is a knowledge of God, right? And I'm willing to go there, but the point is that it's subjective. Right? It is something that you have to tap into. It is something that you have to experience. Philosophy is not going to do it. Theology is not going to do it. What is going to do it is a practice, that, and a lifestyle, and an intention, and a development of awareness or consciousness within oneself. That is how to know God. The theology and philosophy can help. It's necessary. I think we as human beings should always philosophize and break down our comprehension of things to see what aligns more with truth. But it's not in terms of salvation. From my perspective, I mean, Aqidah worshippers got it wrong. It's not about Aqidah. It's rather about Tazkiyatun Nafs and an apprehension of the divine via the fitra, via subjectivity. So, but that's the perennial philosophy, right? And Muslims have reasons to argue against it. We're not going to get into that right now, because some of the arguments that the Muslims would make from the Quran came up in the debate between Hashmi and Elmasry. So before we go any further, I uploaded this video of Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, basically speaking of pluralism. And Daniel Haqiqatjou, just a few days ago, actually uploaded the video that I made, and he put it into 3 parts, criticizing Hamza Yusuf.
First of all, I want to thank Rabbi Michael for contacting me, asking me to come and talk, because one of the things that I like about Rabbi Lerner is he's an inclusive person, and one of the things that our Abrahamic traditions suffer from is exclusivism. Many of the peoples that adhere to Abrahamic teachings, whether they be Jews, Christians, or Muslims, tend to see themselves as having some monopoly on the truth. And monopoly on the truth, as far as any real Abrahamic tradition would say, would be God's alone. And that's why arrogating the voice of God to oneself is probably the most dangerous and really the capital sin of people that claim God, to arrogate that voice. God, if we accept or even assume the possibility that He did speak, or the divine spoke through these revelations of the Old Testament or the Older Testament, the Newer Testament, and then the Quran, which each one has their claim. If we do accept that, there's certainly God has many voices. And to claim any one voice to be the exclusive voice of God is a very dangerous thing to do. But unfortunately, it's something that we tend to fall into. Human arrogance is a major problem. Pride is actually, interestingly enough, in Mount Purgatorio, in Dante's Purgatorio, pride is at the bottom. It's where you begin. You can't even start ascending the mountain. To get lust is the last one, by the way. But you can't even start ascending that mountain of purifying oneself until pride is dealt with. And religious tradition deals with pride greatly, but one of the major problems is that attempting to get close to God is something that necessitates humility, but at the same time, because so many people are very distant from their experience of the divine, it becomes very easy to start seeing yourself as somehow a cut above the rest when one's living a righteous life or attempting to live a righteous life. When you see a lot of people out there who are living less than righteous lives, it becomes very easy to become arrogant about that, which is why that sin is just such a major focus in the Abrahamic traditions, the sin of pride. It's really the great sin. So just having said that, I honor Rabbi Lerner for doing that. One of the traditions about the Prophet Muhammad, and I would really recommend, because he, I believe, is one of the most defamed people in the West. People, a billion point something, revere and love the Prophet Muhammad. He's worth learning about in the same way Buddha is worth learning about. I mean, when millions of people look to a figure as a source of guidance, it's just a wise thing to know something about those people. Really, because it helps you, to know something about Moses, about Jesus, about Muhammad, about Buddha, about Lord Krishna. And one of the things that really is so striking about studying comparative religion, which is what my degree was in, is that the more you learn about these religions, I have found, the more you come to respect them. And I've been in my share of exclusivist tradition, because when I first became Muslim, that is the type of Islam that I was introduced to. So I've been through my share, so I know how it is to look through the exclusivist eyes. It's very easy to do. It makes the world very simple. All the grays are removed. Black and white are easy colors to negotiate. So it's very easy, but when you begin to look at the nuances of our traditions, what you really find is that they're deeply compatible at those most basic fundamental levels, because they are teaching universal truths, and they would not resonate in the millions of hearts that they resonate in if that was not true. Cults do not last. They don't. They die out. You have cults, and you have cults within universalist traditions. There's no doubt about that. There are cults within Christianity, within Islam, within Judaism, within Hinduism. You will have that cultic phenomenon because it's part of the human condition. But the essential truths are universal truths that ring true for millions of people. The Prophet Muhammad said, human hearts were made to incline to love those who do good to them. That is a statement about human nature, that human hearts incline. Hearts are made to love those who do good to them.
Would you agree with me that even though Sheikh Hamza Yusuf on other occasions has said that he's not a perennialist, that he doesn't believe in universalism, that the statement that was made before this interfaith audience is one, in no uncertain terms, a pluralistic one? Would you agree with that, Brother Amini?
Yes, definitely. I mean, I would say it is a perennialistic one.
Because
So yes,
we want to be fair to him. You know, if he says some that I'm not a perennialist, then even though I mean, do you think that he's conforming to the traditionalists in order to continue to have an impact on the traditional community?
maybe. I mean, I cannot speak for him,
Right.
but I will hold the statement that he said and say, look, he might not be a perennialist, but these statements are perennial and they're beautiful. I'm not
Yeah.
saying that as a jab towards
Right.
Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, because I do consider him to be quite a monument of the tradition,
Yeah.
and so if he wants to be averse to the idea of what it means to be a perennialist and say, look, I'm not a perennialist, I'm a traditional Muslim, fantastic. But his statements, and this is not the only statement. I've listened to a couple of his lectures where he
Many.
talks
Yeah.
about Cyrus, he
Mm.
talks about Buddha, and he has a great reverence for Buddha, by the way,
His
right?
mother
And
was a Buddhist. His mother was a practicing Buddhist
oh wow,
before she passed away. So no, he's interesting. I consider Sheikh Hamza Yusuf to be amongst the Awliya. I do think that this statement is no uncertain terms is a pluralistic, perennialist type of statement. And again, not in it's amazing to see a Muslim of his caliber and his knowledge to be able to still express what he's expressed. But anyways, with that being said, we'll move on to the debate. So, all right, Javad T. Hashmi versus Dr. Shadee Elmasry had this debate. This is the first debate in Islamic history that I have found to debate salvation. I personally had a debate about 11 years ago, maybe more. I haven't looked at when I went to London. I think it was around 10, 11 years ago, maybe more, with Abdullah al-Andalusi, a Muslim apologist from the Muslim Debate Initiative, and we debated salvation and the problem of hell. Right. And I brought my arguments from the perspective of the social sciences and trying to look at this in the context of divine justice. And so this was the first time that I had ever come across a debate where Muslims, meaning my debate was the first one, where the issue of salvation was the motion, right? And so this topic is the only topic, Brother Amini, that has mattered to me in the past 10, 20 years because this is pertaining to the fate of so many human beings that we care about. And so while this isn't an argument from emotion that, I don't want these people to go to hell, they seem like good people, and so therefore they're not going to hell. This is not an argument from emotion, but rather what is the evidence as it pertains to the human condition from the social sciences, and what is the spirit of the message that the religions are getting at. That is kind of how I formulate my argument, right? This argument is between Muslims debating scriptures, right? I've always said that since 10 years ago when I said I'm no longer Muslims, I'm no longer going to hold myself to scripture, even though I find them to be sacred. I believe that the Quran is from Allah. I believe the Vedas is from Allah. I believe that the Bible has been inspired by God. I think everything is from Allah and has the impact that it's supposed to have. So, out of curiosity, because I'm not a scholar of the scriptures, I was interested to see how this debate, which has, and again, in my view, never been debated before. I've been waiting for Muslim scholars to talk about this and debate this almost my entire life. And so debate is extremely important to me, and we're not going to be able to do justice to the debate in this conversation. I mean, there are so many verses of the Quran, so many ayats of the Quran, so many nuances and arguments that were made. We're not going to be able to cover it all. I do want to cover some of the main points and give our reaction to this debate as a preliminary discussion. And in the future, I hope to discuss this debate and the arguments in it with Muslims in the future. What does the Quran teach? What does the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ teach? Is something that I'm always interested in, right? Obviously, I have this conviction in my heart that all will be reconciled unto Allah, that the mercy of Allah is greater than His punishment, that people will not be punished in fire for their beliefs, for their aqidah. That's the perspective I come from. But let's look into the Quran and see what it says and see what it teaches, essentially. So, Brother Amini, there's a lot to cover, but with regards to the debate, Javad Hashmi presents this notion that in terms of the historical situation the Muslims were in, that they perceive themselves as mu'min, which he says is a narrower term that implies a belief in Allah, His Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and the Quran. So when a mu'min is referring to a believer in those things, God, Muhammad, the Quran. Whereas a Muslim is a much broader or wider term that implies a submitting monotheist. Even if they follow their own scriptures and laws, they would be considered a Muslim. And he gives his arguments for that from the Quran and from the Medina document, right? And we're going to get into some of the more specifics with regards to this. But the overall idea is, and I agree with this, the primordial religion, right? To surrender to what is for the purpose of salvation, liberation, moksha, right? Rather than a resistance of what is and therefore suffering, right? Of course, we could get deeper into what that means, but we'll leave it at that. And so Hashmi talks from the Quran to this effect, right? And you and I know that, for example, Jesus is considered the Muslim. The prophets are considered Muslimin, but they did not follow the tradition of Muhammad ibn Abdullah. They did not pray 5 times a day and go to Mecca and so on and so forth. That they had their own exoteric forms and rituals, and they had their own revelations. And so, but the idea is that there is an Islam in which, it is said that we are born Muslim, right? And it is only the world that corrupts us because we are born upon Deen al-Fitra, that which is an innate disposition to know God, right? And so Islam is much broader, and I think all Muslims, mainstream Muslims, Sunni and Shi'i Muslims, would agree to this, that there is a primordial religion, that Jesus was a Muslim. They'll say that we were born Muslim and then corrupted. They'll say that all of creation, and Hashmi brings up this verse as well, that all of creation submits to the will of God. And therefore this is a broader divine principle, and he argues this from the Quran, right? So this isn't a perennialist argument like that, like Yasser Qadi did, that anything anyone is worshipping, as long as they're seeking God, from the Wahdatul Wujud Ibn Arabi Jalaluddin Rumi perspective. This is not that argument. Hashmi doesn't get into it, and rightfully so, and he gets into the scriptures. So Brother Amini, based on the ayats of the Quran, chapter 262, and so on and so forth, Hashmi referring to the primordial religion and giving several examples of it. Is this what the Quran teaches from your perspective, Brother Amini?
Short answer, yes. Actually, 262 and 569, with slightly different wordings, are the two verses that kind of woke me up towards a perennial outlook. Surely those who believe, and those who are Jews and Christians and Sabians, whoever believes in God in the last day and does good deeds, they should not fear, nor shall they grieve, right? So this idea that the salvation, right, which seems to be the opposite of fear and grief, which could summarize the idea of suffering, is to those whoever believes in God and the last day and does good deeds. So there's these three things, right, according to the Quran. But the other verses which point to each community being given their own rituals. And what are rituals for? They're symbolic, exoteric forms which express eternal truths, and practices which are means for us to attain that truth, whether it be prayer or meditation, fasting, right? And the Quran itself says we have granted each of them, right? So do not, be polemical about the matter. So it seems as if people are coming to the Prophet, like and I like Dr. Hashmi's point of view, where he says, look, we're not going post-Quranic, right? Sababun nuzul, the reason of revelation, or hadith, or commentaries. Let's not do that.
Right.
Let's go Quran, right? And trying to evaluate what the Quran is saying, intertextually, subtextually, right? And so it seems as if there are people who are coming to the Prophet and saying, look, why do you have different rituals? That's what the verse seems to be pointing towards. And so the Quran says, look, to each community we have granted rituals. So don't argue with them upon that matter. Other verses, why do they come to you whilst they have the Torah with them, in which there is guidance, right? It's as if there are people coming to the Prophet trying to not necessarily find guidance sincerely, but rather to test the Prophet. Is why do they come to you whilst they have the Torah? And they don't follow their own Torah, which they have. In it were teachings for the rabbis and the prophets, right? And then it says, to each one of you we have granted a way and a method. So even if we do not go full, fledged perennialist, like the way I am, right? Just by looking at the Quran, we can ascertain that the Quran has a perennial outlook, not as this kind of definitionally idea of perennialism, but the idea that ultimately there are different communities and they have different paths and methods by which to attain towards God. And the most important thing is kind of the core theological tenets, God, the last day, right? And the last day here, we could discuss what it actually means, and doing good. These are the tenets that are important. Now, the minutiae of it, the details of it, what is the doctrine? What are the rituals? What is the moral code? Is going to differ amongst each community and each tradition, I would say. Yeah. From the Quran.
Okay, so with that being said, right? So on one hand, we're agreeing that there's a primordial Islam, and Sunni Muslims will agree, Shiite Muslims will agree. There's no dispute about that. The Muslims will say, however, that these are Jews and Christians who either converted to Islam and accepted the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And they get into the Ummah document that this was not the case. I know that we're kind of, on one hand, we're dealing with the verses of the Quran that says, no fear shall come on them, nor shall they grieve. And on the other hand, we're dealing with the primordial religion being Islam as a general principle, right? Of being a submitting monotheist and pursuing righteousness, right? Rather than a mu'min who believes specifically in la ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah and what comes out of that, right? So, I don't know if Sunni Muslims will agree with this distinction, right? Because I'm not sure if Elmasry dealt with that distinction. But let's start there before we come back to no fear shall come on them, nor shall they grieve.
Yeah, so look, if you look at the Quran, for example, right? And this is very important. It says, had the Christians and the Jews followed their books, they would have been upon right guidance. Why would it say that? Why would it be saying it right now? And I usually argue, and this is a logical based argument, why would the Quran talk about the Jews? If the idea is that any upcoming tradition abrogates a previous tradition, why is the Quran talking about Jews at all? The tradition of Christianity should have abrogated Judaism. And we shouldn't have been talking at all about Judaism in the Quran. The Quran should have been addressing Christians and Christians alone and abrogating their tradition. But why does it talk about the Torah? And it uses an Arabic derivation of the Greek term, right? Why doesn't it say hidayah? Hidayah meaning, guidance, which is one meaning of the Torah. Why doesn't it use sharia, which is law, which is another meaning of the Torah? Why does it use a Hebraic derivation? So a Hebraic derivation of in Arabic form, right? So Taurat, right? Okay, let's go to the Christians, for example. Why does it say Injil? Now that's a Greek term, Evangelion. Why doesn't it say Bashara, which is maybe an Aramaic term of the gospel or Evangelion in Aramaic would be something like Bashara, which means the good word. Why doesn't it say that? Why does it use a Greek term to address the books of these people? So if you look at all these things and you're saying, what are you talking about a past community of people? It's addressing people right now, and it's having conversations with them. And it's telling them, look, guys, go back to your books, study them well. And it says, look, people who deviate from the meanings of their text. It doesn't say they've somehow mumble jumbled their text. You see, they're deviating from the meaning, right? So they're, in a sense, that they're causing deviation in the meaning of the words, not the words themselves. So the Quran is affirming these previous texts, right? Because it's the people who it's speaking towards, right? And I remember reading a book by Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds, which kind of opened my eyes towards what the Quran is actually talking about and who it's talking with. And it says the Prophet, peace be upon him, Prophet Muhammad, was a preacher. So we shouldn't think of the Quran as a text. Imagine if you were preaching to people and people, had this urge to write down what you were saying, right? It's homily. It's not, this is a text, right? It's the same way if you look at the Hindu tradition, the rishis, they were merely speaking out these divine words. And then later on, when these things were taught orally, people felt the urge to collect them, as they would say, look, we don't want to forget these teachings. So the Quran is talking to people. It's not, oh God, boom, people. It's having a dialogue with these people and telling them, go back to your scriptures, believe in God, do what is good. And if you look at the structure of the Quran in terms of what it's talking about majorly, do good to people, give out charity, be good to orphans and the needy. The same things that Jesus was doing and the earlier prophets, of course, and being against oppression, right? All this, the doctrinal part, which is essential, it's not, in a sense, we're not saying it's something to dump away. I would say it's the most essential, metaphysically and experientially speaking, but the way it's expressed outside is about the community. So the traditions as such are important on a mass level, right? But internally, all these minutiae that people kind of start being polemical and apologetic about would sometimes be a hindrance. And so the Quran itself is somehow against Muslims who are saying, it says this verse, the Jews tell the Christians, you have nothing, you are upon nothing. And the Christians tells the Jews, you are upon nothing. And it says, whilst both of them have been given the book. And then there's another verse which says, the Jews and the Christians say, because we're the children of God, I'm paraphrasing here, that we will be saved. None will be saved unless they're Jew or Christian. Say, let them bring their proof, right? So, and some of the people say the same as they are. Who are those people? If it's not us Muslims who keep saying, oh, we are the only ones who are saved. Just bring your proof. Where's your proof? Right? So we could touch upon that. And of course, Islam being this, not a particular tradition, but the divine tradition as such, the divine primordial religion. Right. And this is clear from the Quran itself. Islam was not the banner used to identify the people who were following the doctrinal path of Muhammad. That was mu'min, as Dr. Hashmi said. Yeah.
And he talks, Dr. It was an interesting point how you brought up how, the Jews have already rejected Jesus. So why, in terms of dealing with them, shouldn't they have to be, the Jews should be dealt with regards to Jesus, and the Christians with regards to accepting Prophet Muhammad. Obviously, the Jews have to accept both, but they have to accept Jesus along the path. So that's an interesting point. Other thing that Dr. Hashmi brought up was the fuzzy borders issue, that religions, according to historians, don't start off the way that we now recognize them as an institution with full set of scholarship and doctrines, but rather it took time to develop. It took these identities, these labels, these doctrines took time to develop. So given that circumstance exists, what comes afterwards, historians want to put that away and kind of focus on what was happening as much as possible in those times, right? Now, I mean, for me, the exegetical interpretation and hermeneutic approach is valuable, but to me, the esoteric approach is what is really important and necessary. But with that aside, I want to come back to no fear shall come on them, nor shall they grieve. Elmasry gives the argument that if you believe in Allah in the last day, that this is a summary, he says, right? And then he refers to Surah An-Nisa, verse 150, and I believe another surah, the Surah An-Nisa, chapter 136. And he says that the idea, and I'll read the verses first. First Surah An-Nisa, chapter 136. O ye who believe in Allah and His Messenger and the book He sent down to His Messenger and the book He sent down before. Whoever rejects Allah, His angels, His books, His messengers, and the last day has strayed far in error. So far, doesn't condemn them to hell, says you've simply strayed, right? But then in chapter 150, those who believe in Allah and His messengers and want to separate between Allah and His messengers and say we believe in some and reject others, we believe in some and reject some, and wish to take a path in between, these are the unbelievers. Now we get a very important word, truly. And we have prepared for the unbelievers a shameful punishment. Now, I think that the key word here is rejection and what they would be rejecting in terms of what the Prophet ﷺ might have been calling towards. But we can get into the details of that. What do you think about Elmasry's argument that when even so all of the verses that say no fear shall come on them nor shall they grieve, if they're predicated with this notion that believing in Allah in the last day implies accepting all of His messengers, His angels, His books. What do you think about that argument? And this is a question that I would like to ask, Muslims who might be thinking that the Quran is teaching pluralism and universalism. What about this argument? What do you think?
Okay. What does it mean to believe? What does it mean to believe? We should start there. Does it mean that one has to follow the creed of that particular prophet or the general divine message? Right? Because if we're saying that it is the former, we have to follow the creed, then there's a big problem. The creed of Jesus is not the creed of Moses. The creed of Moses is not the creed of Buddha. The creed of Buddha is not the creed of Lao Tzu. And all the other prophetic figures.
Brother Mini, I think that the Sunni Muslims will say that they had all. They wouldn't include Buddha, but in terms of the Abrahamic prophets, they would try to argue that they were upon the creed of Tawheed, right? Their rituals were different. Their Sharia was different. But in terms of the basic core, it's the same across the Abrahamic traditions. That's what Sunni Muslims would believe. But I'm with you. The idea is that how do we define believe and reject, right? To me, rejection implies that you're rejecting the purification process, the process of abstaining from the dunya and focusing on the akhirah, focusing on your qalb, akhlaq, adab, ikhlas. But the Sunni Muslims will say, no, these specific rituals, you have to pray in Arabic, exoteric form, up and down, rakat, the various rakats and so on and so forth, five specific times a day. You have to believe specifically in these doctrines, and now you're a Muslim. This is what it means to accept all His messengers rather than wishing to take a path in between. And so, if I were to talk to Hashmi, I would ask him the same question. I just think that it's a difficult conundrum, this particular verse, However, from a perennialist perspective, what it implies is that you're rejecting the message to self-purify, to know God, to worship God alone, and so on and so forth, right? Rather than worshiping the dunya, because the shirk, in my view, is worshiping the dunya instead of Allah, including Aqidah worshippers who are committing shirk, right? From my perspective. So, I mean, this is a tough one, but you definitely continue, Brother Amini. I want to give you a full.
Yes.
answer.
So look, as I would say, for me, what is identified, as the historical critical method or the academic method, I'm not on that side of interpreting the Quran, although I do learn from it. Right? It's a very useful method, and since you're checking out all of these post-Quranic or post-textual evidences or whatever, and focusing on the text and the intertextual and in the milieu of the times. So I do learn that from the historical critical method, but I do have my own ways as well as a perennialist traditionalist, right? And to answer your question, I will say the same thing: rejection here, because the prophets, who are the prophets really? They are the manifestations of the divine message on the human plane, right? So all of them. I believe Socrates was one of them. Lao Tzu is one of them. Confucius is one of them. Buddha is one of them. Muhammad, Abraham, Moses, all of this, right? But we can't follow all creeds. That's impossible, right? I can't syncretize all methods. It's an impossibility. There's so many methods, right? Now, what you do is, if you follow one method, follow it really well, right? Try your best. But it doesn't also mean that you can't learn from other traditions. So, for example, I'm a Muslim. Well, some wouldn't consider me Muslim, but it's okay. I'm a Muslim. I, pray my 5 daily prayers. I fast Ramadan. Hopefully Ramadan is coming soon, and I'll fast that. Right? Hopefully going to Hajj someday. But I also meditate. Right? Learning the breathing techniques from the Buddhists and the Hindus. Right? And I read the Vedas and the Upanishads. Right? And so, what does that make me? I don't follow their creed in terms of the practices and the daily issues, but I study them. So the thing here is, that is accepting all the prophets. Now, the Muslims say, oh no, Muhammad was the last prophet and he kind of brought everything together, and so we don't need to look anywhere else. Oh, no. Right? The Quran itself is telling us to go back to the scriptures, to other scriptures, to ask the people of the scriptures to believe in those scriptures as well. So if I was to dialogue with a Jew or a Christian, I would say, look, I'm not telling you to follow the creed of Muhammad, nor do I believe that's necessary. But I'm telling you, look into his teachings. Read his teachings, study his teachings, and affirm that his teachings are pointing towards one truth the same way your truths are pointing to that primordial truth, right? So, and there are Christians and Jews who do it to this day, I'm telling you. I've seen lectures on YouTube. I've talked to Christians and not Jews, but talked to Christians. And I've seen Jews who affirm the validity of not only Muhammad, but also Jesus as prophetic figures, but they don't follow their creedal path, right? If that, no problem at all. Now, on the other side, as you're saying, this idea of the torment, what is the issue here, right? What is torment? Now, if you're to go into the more allegorical stuff, which is not really what was being done in the debate, we would say, look, torment really here is not somewhere else. You've been in psychology. Torment is not, we don't have to delay torment and say, oh, hell is that world tomorrow. Dante did it right now and showed us, look, it's this internal path here. The moment you feel the separation between me and you, between me and something else, the moment I feel alienated from this world, I'm already creating torment for myself. So to believe in God and the messengers and all this and all that is merely to bring that back to the unity and realize myself as an expression of all the happenings of the world, right? And whatever befalls me, what am I? I merely affirm that everything is in its proper place, and that is paradise, right? That is, the Ridwan, to be in a state of bliss. It's not tomorrow. People are so focused on tomorrow. Of course, that's a more esoteric reading of this meaning of punishment and all that. I don't believe if you were to ask me, even though I'm a Muslim, I don't believe there's a day tomorrow waiting for us where there's some being called God, because I don't believe God is a being. I believe God is being itself, it's reality itself, right? I don't believe that there's a tomorrow. I believe there is a now in which I can either be in paradise or I can be in hell. And I am my own reason. The Quran itself says anyone who is saved, it's by their own, anyone who does good, it's for their own selves, it's for their own souls. Anyone who does bad, it's for their own souls. We are constantly damning or saving ourselves, right? The reality is simply there observing and telling us, look, you have all the keys for your own prosperity. Oh, and of course, for that, we have to be ever cognizant and ever aware of not only ourselves internally, but the whole world surrounding us. And that's why are these traditions preaching, the Eightfold Path, for example, or the Sharia in Islam? Be good to people, give charity, all these kind of do good things. Why are they so important? It's to harmonize ourselves and the community. Because if the community is not harmonized, there's a very low chance that I will be harmonized, right? But if I harmonize myself and hopefully other people harmonize themselves, we have an integral community, and integrity here is the most important thing, the integrality, right? We have an integral community, and this is why the prophets were coming, to integrate the communities in a harmonic way. And once that is done, everyone has a chance, a great chance, of course. Everyone has a chance all the time, but there's a greater chance for harmonizing our internal selves so that we are in a state of bliss always. Not tomorrow, now. That's the most important thing. Yes, back to you, Brother Farhad. You're muted,
The
brother.
idea is is inner peace, right? Qalb salim, through this process of knowing God, right? Knowing truth. I've always said that how can I be at peace, really and truly, in the world or in the afterlife, if everyone isn't at peace, right? Until all is at peace. I could never fathom how suffering and torment and torture in the world or in the next could possibly be happening, and yet I'm sitting here in peace. I don't think that it's possible. However, to know that all of this is for a reason and that all will be at peace, that is what gives me peace now in the dunya, right? That all will be reconciled unto God in terms of that ultimate salvation, right? Granted, that's near here nor there. All right, there's a few more things to cover. I wanted to look at the thesis of Shadee Elmasry. On his slide, he says, belief in the Prophet ﷺ after receiving news from him is necessary for salvation, right? Now, according to mainstream Muslims, what does that mean again? We just covered what that means in terms of what it means to believe in the Prophet ﷺ. What that again means to them is that you are having the intention of praying 5 times a day in Arabic, going to Hajj, doing Ramadan, specifically that exoteric form. That's what they think, right? Whereas from our perspective, I would say that the spirit of the message, that there is a message that he's bringing, right? From our perspective, it's as simple as, tazkiyatun nafs, not be a good person. That tazkiyatun nafs isn't be a good person, right? Tazkiyatun nafs is a process and transformation of the soul that then brings about good behavior, right? That's kind of how it's supposed to work, right? So it's not like we're stacking up good deeds versus bad deeds. That's not what it's about. It's about the growth, the maturity, the evolution of the soul, of the individual, learning lessons, becoming a better version of yourself, and so on and so forth, right? So it's not like, the Christians say that, oh, you think that you're going to get to heaven by your good deeds. No, right? You think you're going to get to, Muslims say you think you're going to get to heaven by your aqidah or your doctrines. No, right? If your doctrines and beliefs lead you to a lifestyle that then brings about the spiritual transformation that is necessary, brings you to that awareness of God, that all will be reconciled and that all is one with God, essentially, then that is what brings about that inner peace, that qalb salim, that liberation that we're looking for in this dunya and inshallah the akhirah, or whatever subsequently happens to us when we die. So that's kind of how I look at his thesis. He would obviously Shadee Elmasry would absolutely refuse to see it that way, though. Any thoughts on that? I know that this is kind of what we're covering in a nutshell.
Yeah, if you look at the Quran, right, it does point to the idea that the people who were within the Prophet's milieu had to follow the Prophet, right? And look, not to deny the divine, but imagine you're a person in 600 AD Arabia, and this handsome guy, this kind, cool dude, right, is coming to you with a message, right? And he's promising, tatma'inna al-qulub, right? This kind of the tranquility of the heart in this world, but also some salvation in a later world, right? And he's preaching, and he's basing his thesis upon the previous text. Let's take it from a purely human perspective, right? Now he's again in his preaching, there's a lot of wordings, right, that seem to echo the previous texts, right? And third person narrations. It says you have to believe in the Prophet, right? All Prophet is his, because really, whose mouth are we hearing it from? Muhammad's mouth, right? Again, we don't hear God directly. We're hearing it from a person's mouth, who's Muhammad's mouth, right? So obviously, when this figure gains political dominance in his community, which he does in Medina, right, there's obviously going to be a certain shift from a more esoteric, kind of more doctrinal reading, right? So in other verses, you'd find, Man amana billahi wal yawmil akhir wa amila salihan. Only these three tenets, right? God, the last day, and good deeds, right? Wala asr inna al-insana lafi khusr illa alladhina amanu wa amilu salihat. Every man is in damnation except those who believe and do good deeds, right? So, but later on, he's a political leader, right? So what Dr. Hashmi was saying is, look, we have to be able to identify what it means to follow the Prophet. So Dr. Elmasry is saying, look, no, it's credo. We have to follow him in every way, shape, or form. But I'm agreeing with Dr. Hashmi that it is, we also have to see it in a socio-political aspect, that yes, remain with your creeds, but in this particular instance, right, this political figure, this socio-political leader, should also be followed in the social spectrum, right? Now, of course, obviously, beyond that, we cannot apply it, because as we speak, we are not under the socio-political leadership of, Muhammad ibn Abdullah, or peace be upon him, right? We're not. But we have the creed of Islam, which is one creed we can take, but we have other creeds as well, which were affirmed by Muhammad ibn Abdullah himself, right? And of course, later on, Muslims who gained power, because again, there's this idea when you have power, you can dictate what terms you like. And how is it? It's easy to prosecute people. It's easy, very easy to prosecute people if you can justify it. Justify it by what? Saying, look, the Prophet said this. Now, I'm not saying all hadiths are fabrications, because I do affirm some hadiths, not all of them, right?
Yeah.
But
I
some
think
of them,
Hashmi would say that too. I don't want to speak for him, but I don't know. We'll figure that out. I don't think he's a hadith rejecter, right? He hasn't claimed to be. I know he's critical of hadith, as historical critical scholars are, which is fine. That's different than rejecting altogether. But we'll see as he continues to explain his perspective on his YouTube channel. All right, one thing that I wanted to talk about, Brother Amini, was the Ummah document, the Constitution of Medina. Now, this is something that most Muslims might be unfamiliar with, in the sense that, it's not taught to us every day that the difference between mu'mineen and muslimin, particularly in the context of how it's referred to in the Constitution of Medina. And the idea is that this is a document from Muhammad, the Prophet, between the believers, mu'minun, and the submitters, muslimun. Now, if this is a document between the mu'minun and the muslimun, this is for the first time that we're ever hearing, I'm ever hearing, that there's a difference between the community of Muslims and the community of believers in that historical context, and that Muslims even had such an understanding historically. Did you want to share any thoughts on the Constitution of Medina? What is your understanding of it? If you could share, Brother Amini.
To be very, very honest, that's something that I was new to me as well, right? So,
fair enough.
Again, being raised from a very traditional conservative Sunni family, something I didn't hear about. Most of the times, one of the treaties that is most mentioned is the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, right? Whereby it's always mentioned in a way whereby the Prophet was somehow forcefully, in a sense, forced to not attribute himself as a prophet, and all this Sahaba were kind of angry. But forget that. Let's talk about this particular one, whereby it's even critically accepted to be within the milieu of the Prophet. This idea of the distinction between the Muslimun and the Mu'minun. Right? So again, if you read the Quran and use this document in a sense as a way to understand the milieu of the Prophet, the Mu'minun were the people who creedily followed the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. Right? So there's a verse in the Quran where it talks about, do you count that you'll enter paradise whilst you haven't faced the calamities that the Prophet and those who believed with him faced, right? So وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مَعَهُ. So the people who believed creedily with the Prophet were the mu'minun, right? And then you have the Muslimun as those who submitted, right, socio-politically to the Prophet, right, or those who were adherents of the previous traditions, but identified as submitters, right? So, as you pointed out earlier, these things are quite complicated in the sense that we are 1,400 years apart, right? And you have a text which was spoken by a religious figure initially, but later on a socio-political and religious figure that is compiled into one text, or what we know as the Quran. But there's a lot that we, in a sense, cannot directly understand as to the pure nuance of that community. So we have to go back to the Quran and try to infer what is really being talked about. So a document like this helps us. It's really helping us to understand, those who somehow see a distinction between mu'minun and muslimun are somehow on some point, right? It's not something purely out of a fancy hermeneutics. There's something of validity here, right? And so why the distinction, right? And who are these muslimun? Are they the people who follow, quote unquote, this specific tradition and creed called Islam? It seems not. Because even the Quran itself seems to not point to that creed that we today call Islam.
Right.
Right?
And hence the fuzzy borders argument and stuff like that, which was, I think, a sound argument. Very sound argument. Okay, interesting. So, Brother Amini, let's kind of wrap up and draw our conclusions. How did you think that the overall Hashmi's debate went with Elmasry? Is there a way to see eye to eye from both sides, or is it, meaning, is there a middle path, or is it pretty much, universalism versus exclusivism? Is there a middle path, or is it one or the other? What did you think of the debate? Any concluding remarks from you, Brother Amini?
I would say we should follow the Quranic teachings, in the sense that it tells us to each of us is a method and a way, right? And if God had wanted, he would have made us one community, but he didn't. But that is to test us. What should we do? We should compete to that which is good, internally and externally. Internally, as we talked about, to the purification of the heart, and externally by how we engage with the community, right? And the environment and the world that surrounds us. Now, there's always going to be disagreement and debate. The Quran actually points to that there is, God will tell us as to what we differ. It doesn't say God will tell us who was correct. It says God will inform you as to your differences, right? That means there is a wisdom behind the differences. So I would say the middle path is focus within, focus on the tazkiyat an-nafs, focus on the purification and transformation of your own soul, right? If you focus too much on saying, oh, he's a kafir, he's a heretic, he's a zindiq, that's where the problems begin. You're taking the helm of God and saying, look, you are damned to hell forever, right? And as Sheikh Hamza Yusuf said, the greatest of problems with the Abrahamic adherents is this idea that they have a monopoly on truth. And this creates a pride in us, and this pride, pride is one of the greatest sins. Right? It covers and veils us from reaching our actual truth. And that is why Rumi and Ibn Arabi and the other mystics, after realizing this perennial truth, said, look, I am, the Muslim who's praying towards the Kaaba. I am the gazelle. I am the idol worship. I am all these people who are trying in one way or another to connect with their divine source. Because Sabbaha lillahi ma fi samawati wa ma fil ard. Everything in the heavens and the earth glorifies God. That will be my concluding statement.
Alhamdulillah. Alhamdulillah. No, absolutely. I'm thinking of the verse. Hashmi also quoted it while you were speaking. Chapter 5, verse 48. That for each among you, we have appointed a law and a path. And had God willed, He would have made you one community. But He willed otherwise. So race with one another in good deeds. So, with that being said, وَلَآخِرُ الْدَعْوَانَا إِنَّ الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Jazakallah khair, brother Amini. We definitely will continue to connect. It is an honor to be able to share you with the world, or at least my world. Again, Jazakallah khair, brother. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam.